Hello, and I hope you're having a fantastic day, and thanks for clicking on my Y2K review. I used to post like 2 videos a week, and now it's 1 video a week, and I would like to say that it's seasonal depression, but I'm gonna be honest, and it's like seasonal coziness, like just with the weather, and it's always dark. I'm not experiencing specifically seasonal depression, but it's like I just want to sleep all day because it's so dark, and I have 2 cats and they're sleeping, and I'm like, oh my god, I want to sleep. So I've just been dealing with this like existential fatigue, and like I'm so tired. So that's why the videos have been taking a bit longer to get out, and I appreciate your patience, and thank you for everyone who subscribed to me, especially if you're coming from TikTok, because I really appreciate that you liked my videos enough to go onto a different platform. That means a lot to me. But anyway, today we're going to be talking about Y2K. It's the newest A24 horror movie, and it came out literally 3 days ago in theaters. I do have a lip piercing that I got a day ago, so if it starts looking fucked up because it's so brand new, you're on a horror review channel. If you can't handle a little bit of blood from a piercing, I don't know what to tell you, you're in the wrong place. If you don't like this movie, there's nothing wrong with you. This movie is a specific genre that is so divisive, and if it's not for you, it's just not for you, and I understand that. I'm gonna talk about why it is the way it is, and I really like it, but why a lot of people won't like it. And the reason why a lot of people won't like this is because Y2K is a horror comedy, and horror and comedy go together like 2 things that probably shouldn't go together. In the early 2000s, there were a lot of these horror comedies, and they all had 2 things mainly in common, and the 2 things were gore and a silly plot to offset all that gore. This is also sometimes called a black comedy, but I think a black comedy is a little bit more like serious and a little bit more heavy than a horror comedy. Like a black comedy would be Sorry to Bother You and Parasite, because they have heavy comedic elements, but the subject matter is actually very heavy. And I think the difference is the horror comedies have very light subject matter, and they're fundamentally a comedy with horror elements. And why would we make those? I'm gonna talk about it. I'm specifically talking about trashy, gory comedy horror. Cabin Fever, Scary Movie, obviously. Stupid things like The Ginger Dead Man and Tokyo Gore Police. Final Destination, Idle Hands, even Zombieland could be considered a horror comedy. Shaun of the Dead, etc. There were a lot of these that came out in like the early 2000s, and they kind of stopped happening, and people didn't not try to make them. Like, it's not for a lack of trying, it's just for a lack of it actually being funny and actually working. There hasn't been like any in the last, I want to say 5 or 10 years that have really, I think, been a genre definer like Scary Movie was. And I know they made like 50 scary movies, but I'm talking about original concepts. You could argue that like Bodies, Bodies, Bodies and Spree fit into this category, but I genuinely think those are too much of a horror movie, or it's too heavy of a subject matter or a metaphor to deal with. And that's not what the horror comedy is about. I think Thanksgiving does fit into this category, the one with Addison Rae in it, but it just doesn't feel new. It feels like it's not bad, but it does feel like it kind of is a revamp of just the previous movies of its kind. This genre specifically is defined by its absurdity and its satire. It's just fun to watch, number 1, and number 2, it's like a time capsule on what people thought was funny in that time period, and it also doesn't really go far in its metaphor or its meaning. It's just a satire, and it's comedy for comedy's sake, it's horror for horror's sake. But the most interesting thing I think about why these silly movies worked and were so influential, like I would even argue Jennifer's Body is one of these movies, because it is really funny. Like, there's a lot of really funny bits in it, and it's kind of over the top, but it was so influential. So many people still talk about it and watch that movie all the time. I just think the intersection of something being funny and being gory has a really, really intense energy that a lot of people really resonate with and think is fun to watch. And obviously, like it's kind of like hedonism. But the main thing I think is that they work because they don't humanize the characters. Because when you don't humanize your characters and you use stock characters and skits, the dramatic and gory deaths don't feel as bleak or as heavy as they would in a movie that was tackling more serious subject matter. Like Parasite tackles like class consciousness in such a heavy way. The comedy is there, but it doesn't offset how bleak it feels. But in my opinion, I think A24 once again has made movie history with Y2K. And my opinion is that they just revived a dead, dying genre. But the fun thing is I think they were able to do this by breaking all of the rules that this genre usually follows. Y2K is specifically for people who know all the trends of the classic 2000s horror comedy, and it's for a very specific audience, just like all horror comedies are for. This movie is genuinely stupid, but so is Scary Movie, and that was huge when it came out. So is Idle Hands, and that is still like a Halloween classic to me. They're stupid, that's the whole point. And this is a stupid movie. And I think a lot of people think of A24 and they're like going to see an A24 movie and they're thinking, this is gonna be really deep and artsy. And this has artsy parts of it, but it's not a deep movie. If you're someone who enjoys these types of films, you will love this movie. I had a permanent smile my entire time watching it. I was like permanently laughing, and I actually don't think one of the jokes fell flat for me, and I think that was really funny. I think A24 is so good at reinventing and redefining movie genres in the reality we live in where they've already done everything before. And I think Tusk was a premonition to this. Tusk being made was a premonition to this stupid movie being made that I gave 5 stars. And you can trust me because I spent $60 a year on Letterboxd Patron. I don't know if I regret that or not. Like, I don't care how much money I make in my whole life. That's a lot of money for an app. And I'm like, I don't know. I really had a really fun time the first day when I was changing all the album, when I was changing all the posters, but just thinking about $60. So here are the unwritten rules of a horror comedy. Practical effects, dehumanized characters, edgy humor, and it is for a specific audience. Y2K breaks basically all of these rules, but it pays respects to the important ones, and that's brilliant filmmaking to me. When it pays respects but also reinvents a dead genre, that's cinema. That's a fresh comedy, and that's something that will be a cult classic down the line. It created a cult classic for people in 5 years. I think it was easy to say like this genre is dead because we can't handle comedy, we're too sensitive, but it basically proved that wrong in one foul movie swoop. It proved everybody wrong. I think also studios are less willing to make a movie like this because they're worried it will be a flop, and also it's like too risky or controversial to make a comedy in the vein of 2000s early comedies, because even The Front Room was a bit insensitive, and I can see how that was a risk. I really enjoyed The Front Room too, so I don't know, but I think that was another one that was a bit riskier for A24. But out of all these rules, it does follow a few of them. Most importantly, it follows practical effects and set design rule. A staple of this genre that kind of goes unspoken but everyone enjoys is it has become a way for practical effects people to showcase really dramatic and crazy and gory deaths in a safe space. It allows the artists to show their prowess in like a really silly, low stakes environment where it's not the most important pivotal point of the movie, it's just a part of another skit. And the gore can really go all the way and beyond in this situation because it's supposed to be funny. So you can go crazy and do crazy stuff with it and have silly deaths. And that's fun for a lot of horror fans because you're so used to seeing it in such a serious environment. It's fun to see what these artists can do when there's no constraints. Y2K could have gone full CGI with all of the deaths and the monsters in this movie, and they did not. I think they even maybe use stop motion, which is insane. And I'd say maybe Final Destination is an exception to this rule, but most horror comedies really showcase really creative, unique practical effects deaths. I would say most of the early 2000s horror comedies do a satire of other horror movies, but Y2K did a satire of a bunch of different movies. There were so many moments that were making fun of movie tropes that were beyond horror, but somehow they were so fresh. Another thing they didn't do was they didn't use stock characters and they didn't dehumanize their characters. And that was something that could have gone really horribly wrong. First of all, the classic like punching down, edgy humor is not present in this movie at all. It makes it so much more enjoyable to watch because I don't know if anyone else feels this way, but when I'm watching specifically a comedy movie, I feel a little weird and uncomfortable. And even like as a woman, like that sounds stupid, but I do feel weird and uncomfortable sometimes when I'm watching a movie and it's making a really unfunny joke about something that's like a racial or gender stereotype and you're like, oh my God, this is so dumb. But I genuinely think Y2K, you could see it with any single person and nobody's going to feel singled out or no one's going to feel uncomfortable by being there. And that is really important. And that's like crazy that it's so funny and it's able to do that. It's able to make no one uncomfortable. And that's a generalization for me to make, but I feel comfortable in saying that. Obviously, the two main characters are bullied for their appearance, like because they're like dorks or whatever, but the movie itself doesn't feel like it's punching down on them or punching down on the women or the people of color. It doesn't feel like that. Like in a lot of 2000s movies, there are a lot of like fat jokes, racist jokes, misogynistic jokes, but they feel like the lifeblood of the comedy, whereas in Y2K, it relied on stunt humor and situational humor rather than like racy one-liners and like edgy one-liners and whatever. Why has that not been done before? I don't get it. I feel like Bottoms did that very well, where the movie's so fucking funny, but it doesn't depend on like edgy humor in the traditional sense, but it is very edgy in its own way. It just doesn't feel punching down so much. And I think I'm really excited to see more movies like that because I do love to laugh and I do love comedies, but I hate having to like zone out at certain parts because I just feel weird. The biggest part about this movie that blew me away though was the fact that they didn't dehumanize their characters or make them into stock characters. And the reason this could have gone horribly wrong is that in a comedy movie and a horror movie mixed, if your characters are too human, their deaths feel very scary and bleak, and that's not the mood you're going for. You're trying to showcase comedy and situation, but you're also trying to showcase practical effects. You don't want it to feel bleak and heavy, especially when you walk out of the theater. You don't want to feel like you just saw Hereditary. Also, the women are so different and like they're so much more three-dimensional, and also with the men, like there's so many different types of men. It's not all stock characters, which is just like so much more interesting. The added dimension to the characters, although that added more weight to their individual deaths, it actually made all of the jokes way funnier, so it evened out in the end and it wasn't like the kiss of death. Like it didn't take away from the horror comedy aspect of it at all. So in conclusion, Y2K I think just revived a genre that everybody forgot about, and it made it for an audience today to enjoy. And I think for a lot of us, horror comedy is the first way that we interact with horror at all because it's a safer space, it's less serious, it's lower stakes, and it's funny. And it's also a really great little time capsule for what people at the time think is interesting and what they think is funny. I really enjoyed Y2K. I think it was great, but because it's so stupid, it's not gonna be for everyone, and it doesn't make you like less of a horror fan if you don't like it, and if you don't like horror comedies, like obviously. And that's the quickest I can talk about it in a way that's not going to spoil the movie for you. I haven't laughed that much in a theater since Bottoms, and if you liked Bottoms, you're going to like this. But that's all I have to say about Y2K. Thank you for tuning into my review, and I'm genuinely so excited for my next like horror video essay thing. I'm going to do it more geared towards it's a cult I'm going to talk about, and I'm actually reading a couple memoirs, like audiobook style, just while I worked, really get information about it because I want to do a real deep dive. And it's so interesting so far. I'm so excited to talk about it. But yeah, thank you for subscribing. Thank you to everyone who's new, and I hope you are having a good holiday so far. I don't know who else is seeing Nosferatu on Christmas Day or Eve or whatever, but I am. I never thought my life would get that free where I could do that, genuinely. Like, that's something I could never have imagined I could be able to do.